Masechet Shevuot, Daf Mem Gimel. In the Mishnah, we saw machloket between Rabbi Meir and Chachamim. If someone comes and claims, says, you owe me 10 vines full of fruit. And the other one says, no, I only owe you 5 of them. Rabbi Meir said he is liable to make a vow, a Shevuot modeh b'miksat, even though it's connected to the ground. These are vines connected to the ground, but he says it's liable anyway. They're not actually the ground. It's not like disputing land itself. If I say, you owe me 10 acres and it's only 5 acres, and the other person says only 5 acres, then there's no vow. We said there's no modeh b'miksat vow regarding land. But here Rabbi Meir says it's liable. So is that because it's not actual land, it's just something connected to the ground? Whereas Chachamim say, no, anything connected to the ground is like the ground itself. So since Chachamim are giving that reason, it sounds like Rabbi Meir disagrees with this principle. And that's the opening question. Rabbi Meir omer yesh devarim shem kekarka ve'enam kekarka v'chule. Mekelad Rabbi Meir savar kol mechubad lekarka eno kekarka. So is this to say that according to Rabbi Meir, things that are connected to the ground but are not the ground itself are not considered like the ground? They're like movable objects? If so, if so, then the Mishnah could have taught a bigger chidush. Instead of saying that they disagree regarding laden vines that have grapes on them, talk about empty vines, that even empty vines, I sold you 10 empty vines, I say, and you say, I lent you 10 empty vines, and you say, no, only 5, and so I only have to give you back 5. So that would be a bigger chidush. Why do you bother talking about the grapes? Even the vines themselves, they're connected to the ground, but they're not the ground themselves. Rabbi Meir would say that one would have to make a vow in such a case. Ela amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, hachab anavim hamdot libaser kamipalge. Rabbi Meir sabar kibsurot amyan v'Rabbanan sabre la kibsurot amyan. Rather, since the Mishnah does not talk about empty vines, but rather vines with grapes on it, it must be that that's the main point of their argument. Everybody agrees that something that's connected to the ground is in fact like the ground. Rabbi Meir would also agree. And if the dispute was about empty vines, then everybody would agree that there'll be no vow. Rather, we're talking here, according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, about grapes that are ready to be harvested. And Rabbi Meir says, since they are ready to be harvested, even though physically they are connected to the vine, but it's as if they are already harvested. In the farmer's mind, they don't need any more sustenance from the vine. They're not getting any more sustenance, and they're ready to come off. And so it's as if they are movable objects. And so the argument is about actually how many grapes. And so I say, you owe me 10 vinefuls of grapes, and you say no, only 5 vinefuls of grapes, and those are movable items even though they're technically attached, but since they are ready to be harvested, it's like they are not attached. Where the rabbis say no, they are not already harvested. They're not like they're already harvested because they're not harvested, they're still attached. So the rabbis go by is it physically attached or not? If it's physically attached, I don't care how ripe it is, it's part of the ground. Whereas Rabbi Meir says, we look at the state of mind of the person, and if the farmer says, oh, these are ready to come off, then it's as if they are already off. Next, the Mishnah says that one is only liable to make a vow, modeh b'miksat, if it's something that is measurable by size, by weight, by number. If someone says, you owe me 20 of these, and the other person says, no, only 7 of them, then one makes it. But not if you say, you owe me a lot, and the other says, no, I only a little. A lot and a little, that's not definable. Amar Abaye, lo shanu ela de amar le bayit stam, aval amar le bayit ze male yediyah ta'ante. The Mishnah brought an example of a claimant who said, I gave you a house full of grain. And the defendant says, I don't know if it was full or not. I'm giving back to you exactly what you gave me. That is an example in the Mishnah of something that is not a defined measure, because it just says a house full. How much is a house full? Only if he says a house full up to the ledge or up to the window. One says up to the window, so no, it's only up to the ledge. Then that's something that is measurable. Full, how full is full? So that's not something measurable. measurable. Now Abaye qualifies the Mishnah and says that is only true if the claimant said, Bayit, you owe me a house full of grain. But if he said this house full of grain, then the claim is known. You can go to the house, you can measure how much is the volume inside the house. Full means a full measure of the inside volume of the house. And so only if you say a house, houses are different sizes. Probably talking about storehouses. Some are big, some are small, so that's not definable. But if it's this house, then that is definable. That's Abaye's position. Amar le Rava, Ihachiya de Tanesefa ze omer al haziz וזה אומר על החלון חייב לפלוג ולתנה בדידה במה דברים אמורים בבית מלא אבל בית זה מלא חייב. Rava says if that's the case, that there would be agreement, that there would be a Shevuot, if you said that this house, then how come the Mishnah doesn't give a bigger chidush and say that example? Why did, in continuation of the Mishnah, give a counter example, a contrast between if you say this house, if you say a house full, then that's not immeasurable. But if you say one person says until the ledge, and the other person says no, it was only until the window, then he is liable. Okay, fine, because that's measurable. You can give a bigger chidush that even within, not besides saying up to a certain point in the house, you could say, when is this true that a house full is not considered a definable amount? That's when you say a full house. But if you say this full house, then one is liable. So that would be a bigger chidush that this full house is a defined measure and liable, bigger chidush than saying up to a certain point, up to the ledge or up to the window. So therefore, Rava rejects Abaye's limitation. Ela ma Rava, le'olam eno chayav ad she'yit'anenu b'davar sheb'midah sheb'mishkal sheb'minyan v'yodeh lo b'davar sheb'midah v'sheb'mishkal v'sheb'minyan. Rather, Rava says, really repeating the exact language of the Mishnah, that has to be that the claim is something that is defined by size, weight, or measure, and the defendant has to also say something back. No, not 10 of those, but rather 5 of those. It has to be something that is defined by size, weight, or number. And therefore, according to Rava, it doesn't matter if you say a house or this house. Even if you say this house, that's not definable. Because full, how much is full? Full means up to the ceiling, just a big pile, all over the place, all the different rooms. How about the entranceway? So a full of house is not sufficient because that's not measurable. If you say until the windowsill, all right, that is something that is measurable. Tanya kevateh de Rava. We have a beraita that supports Rava. When someone says, I have a quart of produce in your possession that you owe me, another one says, I don't owe you anything, that's not modeh b'miksat. He rejected the whole thing. Therefore, he's not liable to make a vow. And similarly, if someone says, you owe me, you have in your possession, and you have to give me a large candelabrum. And the defendant says, no, I am only holding for you a small candelabrum. Well, those two things aren't the same. It's not a definable measure. Big. How big is big? How small is small? So this is not something definable, and therefore does not have to make a vow. And same thing if the claimant says, I gave you a large belt to hold and you have to give it back to me. And the other one says, no, I wasn't holding a large belt, but a small belt. So again, large and small are not definable measurements. They're all just relative, and therefore there is no liability to make a vow. However, aval amar lo, if the claimant said, you owe me a quart of produce, the other one says, no, only a half a quart, which is a letech, then that is modeh b'miksat, and that's a definable amount. So there you go. Menorah bat 10 litrin yesh li biyadecha enecha biyadi ela bat 5 litrin chayav. If the claimant says, I have a candelabra that weighs 10 liter in your possession and made out of whatever silver, and so you owe me 10 liter candelabra, and the other one says, no, it was only 5 liter of precious metal, then he is liable because that's a definable amount, 10 versus 5 liter of silver or of gold. Kilalo shel davar leolam eno chayav ad shitanenu b'davar sheb'midah sheb'mishkav sheb'minyan v'yodela b'davar sheb'midah sheb'mishkav sheb'minyan. And here's the summary of the matter. Braita says, one is only liable to make a vow of modeh b'miksat if the claimant asks for something that is measurable by weight, or by size, by weight, or by number, and the defendant has to answer an amount that's less. But it also has to be defined by size, weight, or number. He can't just say, no, it was small. Or he has to say the exact number of how much it is, how much he owes. And now we're going to bring the support for how this Baraita supports Rava. This ending part, when it says, here's the summary, we already gave examples of it. Why do I need the summary? The summary must be adding another case. Is it not coming to include that the case of this house is full is not considered one of a definite weight? And so that's saying kilalo shel davar. It has to be something that is a definite measure. And if you just say bayit zeh, that's not a definite measure. That's a proof for Rava, who says doesn't matter if you say a house or this house, neither of them would one be liable to a vow, because a house or this house, this full house, is not a definite measure. We don't know exactly how much that is. So isn't that a good proof for Rava? Yes, it is. Now that we quoted this Baraita, we want to analyze it further. What's the difference between when you say a big candelabra or small one? Ma she'te'ano lo hodalo, or ma she'hodalo lo te'ano. How come one is patur? Oh, is it not because that which was claimed was not admitted, and that which was admitted was not claimed? Because these are two different items. A big candelabra and a small candelabra are two different kinds of items. You may as well say, you owe me wheat, and the other one says, no, I owe you barley. Those are different things. So too, big candelabra and small candelabra, although they're both candelabras, they are two different items altogether. One stands on the floor and is large. One is a tabletop lamp. So these are different things. Yachi bat aser bat chamesh nameh ma shetano lo hodalo ma shehodalo lo te'ano. If so, then the sefer of the Mishnah, we could apply the same logic. When the claimant says, you owe me a candelabra that is weight of 10 litra, and the other one says, no, a candelabra that's a weight of 5 litra, so you could argue the same thing. The claimant said something that was a big candelabra, 10, and the other one said, no, a small one that's only 5, and those are two different items. So even though you give a defined amount, isn't that talking about two different things? It would be like one says, you owe me 10 pounds of wheat. The other one says, no, 5 pounds of barley. So even though you gave numbers of them, but they're still two different things, because even though these are both called candelabra, but the one that's that big and one that's small, generally would be a different use altogether. It's like a different item. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak, hacha b'menora shel chuyot askinan dekamodeh leminar. Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak says, oh, we're talking about a candelabra that comes in sections, sectional one. Like over here, you can have many sections. This one looks like it's all one whole. But imagine if there's pieces, and you can make it very tall by attaching a lot of pieces to each other, or you could take away the pieces and they just attach to each other like Lego. And therefore, when he says, you owe me one that's large and small, well, how big, how large, how small? 8 feet, 3 feet, that's not defined, and therefore it doesn't count. But if you say 10 litra, then that's something I can measure. Let's see, how many pieces would you have to include for that? So I do owe you a candelabra, many of the parts, but you are asking for 10 litra. Let's say each section is 1 litra. So you're asking for 10 sections. No, I only owe you 5 of those pipe sections, and therefore that is talking about the very same thing. It's not a different type of item. It's not a different item at all. It's the very same items, 10 of these or 5 of these. So that's why it's modeh b'miksat. And it's talking about the same thing. If so, we'd have to apply that logic also to the belt. And instead of saying a belt, well, a big belt is different thing than a small belt. It's not the same item. So therefore, when you say belt, maybe the Mishnah Mishnah, the Baraita, should have said a chain belt, a belt made out of chains that are each attached to each other that you can make bigger and smaller by removing one of the sections of the chain or some of them. So then the Baraita should have said that. If the candelabra was talking about a segment one, then you should also be talking about a segment a belt, but it doesn't say that. Ela de laife la katane, since it does not say a sectional belt. Hachaname b'shel chuliot la katane. Here also, we cannot assume that the candelabra is talking about a sectional candelabra. So that explanation is rejected. Ela amar Rabbi Abba bar Memal shane menorah ho'il v'yachol legorerah ulamida al chamesh litrin. Rather, it's talking about a regular menorah, but it's talking about one that's, let's say, plated with a lot of silver, and it weighs 10 litra of silver. Well, what you could do is you could scrape it down. It doesn't have to be so thick. So it's the very same item, same size, just one will have a thicker body, and then you can scrape it down and it will have less, only have 5 litra of silver, and so therefore that is talking about a modeh b'miksat. It is a defined amount, unlike the beginning where big or small, that's not defined, so it's defined amount of weight. But it's talking about the same item. They're both same shape and basic size. Just one's a little thicker and one's thinner because you could add more or you can scrape away. And that's why that is a sufficient case for modeh b'miksat vow. Next Mishnah, Hamalve et chavero al hamashkon ve'abad hamashkon. Someone lends money to someone else and takes collateral, but then he loses the collateral. And we're going to see a few different variations of this case. Amar lo sela hidviticha alav ve'shekel haya shaveh ve'hala omer lo ki ela sela hilvitani alav ve'sela haya shaveh patur. In the first scenario, the lender says, I lent you 1 sela. 1 sela is equal to 2 shekel. So let's just say in terms of shekalim. I lent you 2 shekalim, and the collateral was worth 1 shekel. So I lost it. He's taking responsibility for losing it. He's supposed to watch it. So he lost it. Fine. So that's 1 sela. We'll consider that paid. But I lent you, that's 1 shekel. We'll consider that paid. But I lent you 2 shekalim, and therefore you owe me 1 more shekel. Ve'hala omer, and the defendant says, the borrower says, no, it's true that you lent me 2 shekalim, that's 1 sela, but the collateral was worth the same amount, was also worth 2 shekalim, and therefore since you lost it, so that's your responsibility, and I owe you 0. Since the defendant here, the borrower, says I owe you 0, therefore he does not have to make a vow of modeh b'miksat. Okay, that makes sense. Now we're going to change one of the factors in case number 2. The claim is the same as in the first one. The lender says, I lent you 2 shekalim, and the deposit was worth 1 shekel, which I lost, so that's considered paid, but you owe me 1 more shekel. Ve'hala omer lo ki ela sela helvitani alav ushlosha dinarim haya shaveh chayav. The defendant says, it's true, you did lend me 2 shekalim, but the item, the deposit was worth 3 dinarim. A dinar is half of a shekel. So we'll convert everything into shekalim. So that's 1.5 shekalim. So therefore he's saying, you gave me 2 shekalim, it's true, but I gave you as a deposit 1.5 shekel, and you lost it. Therefore, I only owe you 0.5 shekel. So now he is modeh b'miksat because the lender says you owe me 1 shekel, and he admitted only to 0.5 shekel that he owes. So that's modeh b'miksat, and he is liable. That was case number 2. Sela helvitani alav ushetayim haya shaveh v'hala omer lo ki ela sela helviticha alav v'sela haya shaveh patur. Now we're switching around who the claimant and defendant is. In this case, it's the borrower that's making the claim because he's saying that the deposit was worth more than the loan. So it's the borrower that's bringing the lender to court. And he says, you lent me 1 sela, and the deposit was worth 2 selaim, and you lost the deposit, and you're responsible for that. Therefore, you owe me one selah that you lost. We'll consider that payment for the loan. But it was worth 2 selaim that you lost, so the borrower says, you owe me 1 selah. But the lender says, no, it's true, I lent you a selah, but the deposit itself was worth only 1 selah. The deposit apparently is not around, so we can't check how much it's worth. And therefore, he denies to have to pay anything. So in this case, the lender, who is the defendant, since he rejected any payment, so that's not modeh b'miksat, and therefore he does not have to make a vow at all. And now the fourth case, the claim is the same. The borrower says, I borrowed from you 1 selah, but I gave you a deposit worth 2, and therefore you owe me 1 selah. והלה אומר לא כי אלא סלע הלוויתיך עליו 5 דינרים היה שווה חייב. And then the claim was, you owe me 1 selah, and then the lender says, no, I lent you 1 selah, but the item that you gave me was not worth 2 selaim, but rather only 5 dinarim, and therefore I only owe you 1 dinar. There are 4 dinarim in 1 selah, because there's 2 dinarim in a shekel and 2 shekalim in a selah. So once again, the borrower says, you gave me 1 selah, but I gave you a deposit worth 2 selaim, so therefore you owe me an entire selah, 1 whole selah, which would be 4 dinarim. And then the lender says, no, it's true, I lent you a selah, and what you gave me was not worth 2 selaim, but rather only 1 1/4 selaim, and therefore I only owe you 1/4 of a selah equals 1 dinar. So that is modeh b'miksat. The claim was for a whole selah, and he admitted only to 1/4 of it, so he is liable. Now we ask, umi nishpa, who is going to make the vow? Misha pikadon eslo shema yishaba ze v'yosi hala et hapikadon. Now we'd expect, who would make the vow? The expected answer would be whoever is the defendant. The defendant is the one that's modeh b'miksat. Someone makes a claim, and the defendant says part of it is yes, part of it is no. That person should make the vow. And the defendant is different in each case. In the first 2 cases, it's the borrower who is the defendant. In cases 3 and 4, it's the lender who's the defendant. That's what we would expect. But the Mishnah gives a different answer, that the rabbis decided, you know what? Whoever has the deposit in his hands, which is always going to be the lender, he should make the vow. Why? Because we're afraid if it's the other person that makes the vow, in other words, the borrower, and he says that in this type of case, where there's a dispute about the value of the deposit, if the borrower would say the deposit was worth this much, then we're afraid that the lender will produce the deposit, and because he said it was lost, but actually maybe he has it, and if he produces it, because and it contradicts what the borrower vowed, then it will prove the borrower wrong, and that will be a false vow. And we don't want to set up a situation where there's going to be a false vow. It's a chilul Hashem. And of course, the purpose of the vow is to root out liars, to make sure the person won't lie. But maybe he wasn't sure, maybe he forgot. So it's better to put the vow of, if it's a case of how much is the deposit worth, then make the person who should be holding the deposit, make that person vow about the value of the deposit. And that way, it's less likely to lead to a problem of a fact contradicting an oath, which would be a false oath and a chilul Hashem. The Gemara asks, Ahaya, this last comment, who makes the vow? He who has the deposit, which clause is it going on? If you say the sefa, ilema sefa, the cases 3 and 4, well then we should know that anyway, because who else is going to make a vow? It's the malveh, the lender is the one that's modeh b'miksat. So obviously he's the one that's modeh b'miksat. So that fits into the general rule, the Torah rule, that it's always the person who is modeh b'miksat, the defendant, who makes the vow. And in cases 3 and 4, it's the malveh who makes the vow, so there's no chidush, there's no change. The one who makes the defendant is also the one who possesses the deposit. So the Mishnah there is not saying anything we didn't know. Amar Shemuel aresha, v'chen amar Rabbi Chia bar Rav aresha, v'chen amar Rabbi Yochanan aresha. And all of these sages explain that even though this clause in the Mishnah is at the end, but actually it's giving a chidush about cases 1 and 2, where the defendant is the borrower, but he's not holding the deposit. It's the lender holding the deposit, and therefore it's teaching that, no, we switch it in this case, even though, according to Torah law, modeh b'miksat, that should be the borrower, the defendant, that makes the vow. But the rabbis say here, you know what? We switch it, and we want the lender to make the vow because he is the one that's holding the deposit. My resha. Now, when you say resha, which case are you talking about? Sefa de resha. The last case in the resha, meaning case number 2, not case number 1, because there is no vow in case number 1. It's not modeh b'miksat. He denies everything. So it's talking about the second case in the Mishnah. Sela halviticha la v'shekel hayashaveh v'hala omer lo ki ela sela halvitani alav u'shlosha dinarin hayashaveh chayav deshuvah gabe lovehi u'shaklu harabanan miloveh v'shadyu ha'amalveh. And that's the case where the lender says, I lent you 1 sela, meaning 2 shekalim, and the deposit that you gave me was worth only 1 shekel, therefore you owe me another shekel. And the defendant, the borrower, says, it's true, I borrowed a sela from you, 2 shekalim, but the deposit was worth 3 denarim, meaning 1.5 shekel, and you lost it, therefore I only owe you half a shekel. So 1 full shekel was claimed, a half a shekel was agreed upon, and a half a shekel was denied, and so that's modeh b'miksat, and that case is liable. In such a case, really, who should be making the vow? The one who was modeh b'miksat, which is the borrower. He's the defendant. But that's the case where the rabbis say, even though mideoraita, the loveh should make the vow, we put it onto the malveh because the malveh is the one that's holding the deposit. Behashtad amar Rav Asher, dekai malan, ze nishba she'ena birshuto, veze nishba kama shaveh, hachika amar, mi nishba techila, mi shapikadon eslo, shema yishaba ze v'yosihala et hapikadon. But now that Rav Asher came and he gave us a new interpretation of the Mishnah, and he said that this is what it means. One person makes a vow that it's not in his hands, meaning the lender who is supposed to have the deposit, he first makes a vow, not about the value of it. He just makes a vow, I don't have the deposit in my possession, so therefore I'm not going to produce it. And then the borrower, the defendant, will make a vow of how much it's worth. Whoever's modeh b'miksat will make that vow of how much it's worth. So actually, according to Rav Asher, there are 2 vows, and it's not and therefore it could be closer to the Doraita law. It is in fact the defendant that's going to make the vow of regarding the modeh b'miksat, and he's going to have to make a vow to the details of it. Right? I borrowed this much. I owe not that much, but only this much. Right? Because this is how much the deposit was worth. So there's always a defendant that's making that vow. What the rabbis did is just added one more step to make sure that the lender doesn't produce the deposit and then show a clear false oath, which would be a chilul Hashem. We make the lender make a vow that he doesn't have it. According to that understanding of the Mishnah, what does it mean in the Mishnah when it says who makes a vow? It means who makes a vow first. And the answer is whoever is holding the deposit makes the vow first, because otherwise, if the defendant, if it's not the defendant is the borrower, makes the vow first, then we're afraid he'll make the vow and says, oh, this thing is only worth this much. And then the lender will produce the pikadon and show it to be a false oath. And therefore we say, let the lender first vow that he doesn't have it. Okay, now he doesn't have it, then the rest of the normal vow is goes upon the defendant, which in that case would be the borrower. Amar Shemuel, Haiman de osfe alfazu ze lechabre, umishken le kata de magala, Avad kata de magala, avad alfazu ze, aval tarte katate la. Shemuel has an important law to teach, that if a person lends to someone else 1,000 dinar, and he takes a collateral of a handle of a sickle, which is not worth 1,000 dinar, let's say it's worth 50 dinar. And then if the lender, loses the handle of the sickle, then he cannot collect the 1,000 dinar that he got. Why? The idea is that if someone takes something as a collateral, he's accepting that collateral as potential payment for the loan. He's saying, listen, if you don't come and pay the loan, then I'm going to keep this item. So maybe I exaggerated. If it's only worth 50, I don't know if anybody would accept that as a collateral for $1,000 item. But maybe it's worth half. Maybe it's worth 500. So he accepted this as collateral, meaning he's mostly trusting him that it's going to come back. But since the lender accepted this item as collateral, it doesn't matter how much it's worth, whether it's equal to the loan or less than the loan, because he accepted it as a potential payment. If he loses it, the lender lost the item, so that's his fault, and then he cannot collect the rest of the 1,000 because the borrower could said, "I gave you the collateral. Give me back the collateral, then I'll pay you the 1,000. I can't give it back to you. I lost it." Okay, so that's it. Then you're accepting that as payment. Too bad. However, even Shemuel will agree that if the lender took 2 handles as collateral, so then already he's not accepting 1 handle as the entire collateral. By taking more than 1, he's saying he's already putting a value on it. 1 is not enough. 2, it's not about the specific value of the item, but rather the collateral is just making sure that the guy's going to come back. And in that case, even if he loses the 2, we see how much were the 2 worth together. If they were each worth 300, okay, he lost 600. Then he still has to pay another 400. So 1 item, we accept that as the total accepted payment, the potential payment, and therefore if he lost it, that's it. He doesn't get anything else. But if it's more than 1 item, then it's not about the item itself, but rather about the value. That's why he's taking more than 1. That's Shemuel's opinion. But Rav Nachman goes a step further. But Rav Nachman amar afilu tarte katate avad chada avad 500 avad idach avad kuleh aval kata v'nascha la. Rav Nachman says even in the case where he took 2 sickle handles, since he took 2, we assume that he's accepting that as collateral and as potential payment. He took 2 because he's accepting each one as collateral for half the amount of the loan. Therefore, it doesn't matter how much they were actually worth. Maybe they were actually only worth 300 each. But if he lost 1, well, since that was considered collateral for half of the loan, then he cannot collect 500 of the loan. But he still has the other one, he could give that back and get 500. But if he lost both of them, then he loses the entire amount of the loan. So Rav Nachman says if it's 2 of the same item that he accepted, then the lender's accepting the 2 items as potential payment for the loan. If he has them, he can give them back and say, I want 1,000 dinar. But if he loses them, if he loses 1, he loses half. If he loses both, he loses the entire right to collect. However, even Rav Nachman would agree that if he took as collateral 2 different items, a handle and a piece of silver, well then, these are not worth the same amount, then it's more obvious that he's relying on the value of the silver and not on the value of the handle. The handle is just an extra thing. And therefore, in that case, if he loses the handle, you won't say he loses half the amount. I know it's 2 things, but one is worth more than the other. So then we'll calculate the value of the handle and he'll deduct that, but he's relying on really the value of the silver. Nehar de'a o amri, afilu kata v'nascha, abad nascha, abad palga, abad kata, abad kuleh. However, the sages from Nehar de'a went even a step further and said that if a lender accepts a sickle handle and a bar of silver, if he loses the bar of silver, that's considered 1/2. And if he loses the handle, that's also considered, then the handle also, then he loses the entire debt. In other words, it's 2 items. The fact that it's 2 items, we don't care that one is worth more than the other. The point is, that's 2 items, so we designate half of the loan for each item. And if he loses one, then that's it. He can't collect half the loan. If he loses both, he cannot collect the entire loan. And so, in other words, collateral is considered. Once you accept collateral, that's it. You're accepting this as potential payment, and the number of items, well, we'll just divide the loan by that number, and we disregard the actual value of each thing. You accepted it as such, as collateral, as potential payment. Now, we have a challenge against Shemuel from our Mishnah. Tenan, Sela halviticha alav shekel haya shaveh, v'hala omer אומר לא כי אלא סלע הלוויתני עליו 3 דינרים היה שווה חייב למלא קיבלתיה. The question is from the second case in the Mishnah where the lender says, I lent you 1 sela, meaning 2 shekalim, and this item that you gave me is only worth 1 shekel. Therefore, you have to pay me 1 more shekel. And I lost it. I lost the deposit, but it was only worth a shekel. And the defendant says, no, the item that I gave you was worth 1.5 shekels, therefore I only have to give you half a shekel, says Modeh B'Miksat, and he has to make a vow. Now we ask, according to Shemuel, why should he have to make a vow? Why shouldn't the defendant be able to say, you accepted this item as collateral? And we just said, according to Shemuel, if you give an item as collateral, it doesn't matter how much it's worth, you accepted the collateral. That is, by definition, then potential payment. And if you have it, you can return it and get a full payment. But if you lost it, then that's it. You accepted that as payment. And too bad, even though he's agreeing that it's worth less than the amount, but it doesn't matter. You accepted that as the payment. So how could Shemuel understand this part of the Mishnah? And the answer is matnitin bide farish. Shemuel bide la parish. The Mishnah is talking about a case where the lender said explicitly, listen, I'm taking this collateral only for its monetary value. I am not accepting this as potential payment for the entire loan, only for what it's worth. He said that explicitly. That's why in the Mishnah, since he said that explicitly, so he can still collect the difference in the value. The question is, what was the value, and therefore, what is the difference in the value? But Shemuel's law was talking about a case where he did not say so. He just accepted the collateral without making that stipulation. And so if you don't make that stipulation, then the assumption is you're accepting this collateral as potential payment for the entire loan. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.